My name is Leonard Holt, and until 2:48 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon in late October, I thought 19 years of loyalty meant something at Cascadia Resource Management. I was 51 years old, a senior client relations manager, and I had spent nearly 2 decades building relationships with the kind of clients that don't come from cold calls or LinkedIn campaigns. They came from trust, from showing up when something went sideways at 11 o'clock on a Friday night, from remembering that the operations director at Pemberton Mining had a daughter starting at UBC the same year my son started at Dalhousie, and asking about her every single time we spoke. That's not a skill you can put in a job posting. It's not something you can train someone to do in 90 days. My wife Karen taught grade 4 at an elementary school in Burnaby. We had a mortgage on a house we'd bought 14 years ago when the market was different. 2 kids in post-secondary, our son in Halifax and our daughter finishing her second year at BCIT, and the kind of life that looked comfortable from the outside but required both of us working full-time to maintain. My total compensation package was sitting at around $313,000 Canadian, which sounds like a lot until you actually live in the Lower Mainland and run the numbers on tuition, property taxes, and the cost of flying your kids home for Christmas. I wasn't rich, I was busy keeping pace. Cascadia had been growing for most of my time there. We managed environmental compliance contracts for resource extraction companies across Western Canada, mining, forestry, a few energy clients up in the Peace region. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was essential, and the clients who stayed with us did so because they trusted us not to let a regulatory filing slip through the cracks when they had an operation running at capacity. I managed 34 active accounts. 34. Some of those relationships I had personally cultivated for over a decade. Then in August, the company was acquired by a private equity group out of Toronto, a firm called Meridian Capital Partners. Within 6 weeks, they had installed a new chief operating officer named Fletcher Walsh. Fletcher Walsh was 38 years old. He had an MBA from Rotman and had spent the previous 7 years at a management consulting firm where, as far as I could tell, his primary skill was producing PowerPoint slides that told other people their jobs were inefficient. He flew into our Vancouver office on a Monday, introduced himself to the management team with a handshake that felt like it came with terms and conditions, and by Wednesday had already scheduled what he called a strategic alignment review for the following month. I didn't think much of it. Every acquisition brings a new wave of someone wanting to prove they've added value. I'd seen it twice before at Cascadia. You put your head down, let them rearrange the furniture, and in 18 months they're either gone or they've figured out how things actually work. I was wrong this time. The strategic alignment review was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon. 14 people in the boardroom, regional directors, senior managers, the head of finance, a few people from Meridian's integration team who had flown in from Toronto. I walked in with a coffee I'd made in the break room and sat down near the middle of the table, next to our director of operations, a woman named Yvette, who had been at the company almost as long as I had. Fletcher opened with a slide deck. He thanked everyone for their time, said he was excited about the company's trajectory, used the phrase value creation 4 times in the first 3 minutes. Standard stuff. I was half reading an email on my phone under the table when the slide changed and I saw my name. Not a reference to my department, not a vague mention of senior client relations. My name, Leonard Holt, and next to it my full compensation package, broken down line by line, base salary, performance bonus structure, benefits, valuation, car allowance. The total figure sitting there in bold, visible to every person in that room. I put my phone down. Fletcher clicked to the next slide. It was a benchmarking analysis. He had pulled market data I didn't know from where, and I didn't recognize the methodology, and had plotted my compensation against what he was calling industry standard for a client relations manager in the natural resources sector. According to his slide, I was being paid 48% above what the market would bear for someone in my role. This is one of several areas, Fletcher said, gesturing at the screen, where we've identified meaningful misalignment between compensation structures and the value being delivered. When we're carrying costs this far outside the benchmark, it's not sustainable, and frankly, it's not fair to the rest of the organization. 14 people in that room. 14 people who now knew my salary, my bonus structure, my car allowance. I watched Yvette very carefully not look at me. I watched the finance director write something in his notepad. I watched one of the people from Toronto tap something on his laptop. I felt the heat come up from my collar, that very specific kind of heat that isn't quite anger yet but is getting there fast. I raised my hand. "Fletcher," I said, "before we go further, did you speak with any of my accounts before preparing this analysis?" He looked at me with the expression of someone who considers the question slightly beneath him. "This is a compensation review, Leonard. I don't see the relevance of client conversations to a cost structure discussion." "The relevance," I said, keeping my voice even, "is that my compensation is tied directly to revenue retention, 34 accounts. I'd like to understand what data you use to assess the value being delivered before we discuss whether that value is appropriately priced." "The benchmarking data speaks for itself. It speaks to the market rate for someone managing administrative client files. That's not what I do." He smiled. It was a patient smile, the kind you give someone when you've already decided the conversation is over. "We can discuss the specifics of your role separately, Leonard. The point today is to flag the structural issue." I looked around the table. A few people were looking at their hands. Nobody said anything. "I want to be clear about what happened next, because I've thought about it many times since, and I want to be honest about it. I didn't make a dramatic speech. I didn't tell him what I thought of him. I didn't say anything about what would happen when I walked out. I just looked at Fletcher Walsh for a long moment, and then I stood up and I picked up my coffee and I said, 'I don't think I can continue to contribute to this meeting.' And I left. I walked back to my office. I closed the door. I sat down at my desk and I looked out at the parking lot for probably 4 or 5 minutes without moving. Then I called Karen. She picked up on the second ring. She was on prep period, she said. I told her what had happened. There was a pause. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I have to think," I said. But I already knew, not because I was impulsive. I'm not an impulsive person. I knew because 3 months earlier, in July, before the acquisition had fully closed, I had received a call from a man named Douglas Farrell. Douglas was the VP of Client Services at a company called Boreal Environmental Partners, a competitor of ours based in Calgary with a strong and growing presence in BC. He had been trying to recruit me for 2 years in the polite, unhurried way that good people in this industry tend to operate. In July, he had finally put a formal offer on the table. More equity, better base, a mandate to build the BC Client Services division from the ground up. I had turned it down. At the time, Cascadia felt stable, and I didn't love the idea of uprooting everything for a move to Calgary, even with a generous relocation package included. After I hung up with Karen, I called Douglas. He answered on the first ring. I told him I wanted to revisit the conversation we'd had in July. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Leonard, I was hoping you'd call. The position is still open. We've been holding it." We talked for 40 minutes. By the end of the call, I had a clear picture of what the offer looked like. It had actually improved since July, because Boreal had landed 2 new enterprise accounts and needed senior leadership in BC more urgently than before. I asked for 24 hours to confirm the terms in writing before I did anything formal on my end. Douglas said, "Absolutely. I'll have the offer letter to you by 9 tomorrow morning." It arrived at 8:47 a.m. I read it twice. I forwarded it to our family's lawyer, a woman in New Westminster who I'd used for real estate and estate planning, and asked her to look it over quickly. She called me back at 11 and said it was clean. Standard non-solicitation language, reasonable non-compete restricted to a narrow geographic and sector scope that wouldn't affect my existing relationships, no unusual exit provisions. At 1:15 p.m. on a Friday, I submitted my resignation. I gave the standard 4 weeks notice required under my employment agreement, and I sent the letter directly to HR and to Fletcher Walsh. Fletcher's response came 40 minutes later. It was 4 sentences. He thanked me for my service, noted that the company would need to conduct a handover of my account files, and said that given the circumstances, HR would be in touch to discuss the transition. He did not ask me to reconsider. I want to tell you what happened over the next few weeks, because this is the part that I think matters most, not for the satisfaction of it, though I would be lying if I said there was none, but because it illustrates something true about how business actually works that no benchmarking slide can capture. By the following Wednesday, 5 days after my resignation, I had received personal calls from 11 of my 34 accounts, not emails, phone calls. People I had worked with for years, in some cases over a decade, calling me directly to ask what was happening, whether I was okay, and where I was going. I was careful in those conversations. I did not solicit anyone. I did not say anything negative about Cascadia or about Fletcher Walsh. I told them I was making a transition, that I was going to be with Boreal Environmental Partners, and that I trusted they would be well looked after. I said it professionally, and I meant it. But relationships are relationships, and people make their own decisions. By the end of my notice period, 14 accounts had formally requested to have their contracts reviewed. 3 of the largest, including a forestry client out of Prince George that I had personally brought to Cascadia 8 years earlier, and a mining operation in the Kootenays that represented one of the company's top 5 revenue accounts, had already begun the process of transitioning their business. I finished my last day at Cascadia on a Friday in late November. The woman from HR walked me to the lobby and handed me a box with my things. She was apologetic and a little awkward about it. I shook her hand and thanked her and walked to my car in the rain. The following Monday, I started at Boreal. 3 weeks into my new role, I got a message from Yvette. She and I had stayed in touch. She wasn't involved in anything competitive. She was just my friend, and she wanted me to know what was happening. She said it carefully, the way you do when you're still employed at a place and don't want to put anything too directly in writing. What she told me was that by the 6-week mark after my departure, 21 of my 34 accounts had either left Cascadia or were in active discussions to do so. The revenue impact, she said, was significant. She used the word significant twice, which told me it was worse than she was saying. I didn't ask for exact figures and she didn't offer them. But 2 months later, a former colleague who had moved on to an industry publication in Calgary sent me a link to a brief item in a trade newsletter. It noted that Cascadia Resource Management had posted a Q4 result substantially below projections, attributed to client attrition in the British Columbia portfolio, and that the company had announced a restructuring that included the elimination of approximately 30 positions. 30 positions to cover the losses generated by restructuring one. I thought about Fletcher's slide, the one with my name on it, the one that said I was 48% above market benchmark and that it wasn't sustainable and it wasn't fair to the rest of the organization. I thought about the 30 people who had worked at that company and were now updating their LinkedIn profiles on a Tuesday morning. I'm not writing this to celebrate that. I want to be clear about that. Those were real people who had nothing to do with any of this, and I'm genuinely sorry for what happened to them. The decisions that led to those 30 layoffs were made by a 38-year-old man with an MBA who flew in from Toronto and thought that value was something you could read off a benchmarking report. It isn't. I'm in my 2nd year at Boreal now. I brought 17 of my original accounts with me, not because I asked them to come, but because they chose to. We've added 9 new accounts since I joined, 3 of which came through referrals from clients I'd never met before. The BC division has grown from 2 people to 11. Douglas gave me the VP title 6 months in, which was not something I had negotiated for and which I didn't see coming. Karen still teaches grade 4 in Burnaby. Our son finished his degree and is working in Halifax now, doing something with marine engineering that I don't entirely understand but that makes him happy. Our daughter graduated from BCIT in the spring and just started a job with a sustainability consulting firm in Vancouver. We still have the house. The mortgage is manageable. The day I cleaned out my desk at Cascadia, I took a small framed print that had sat on my shelf for years, a quote I'd cut out of a magazine sometime in the early 2000s, something attributed to a hockey coach of all people. Your reputation travels faster than you do. It's on my shelf at Boreal now, same spot, same frame. Fletcher Walsh left Cascadia 11 months after the acquisition. His LinkedIn shows he's currently listed as an independent consultant. I don't know what he's consulting on. I didn't look closely enough to care. What I know is this: 19 years of showing up, of returning calls at inconvenient hours, of knowing the names of people's kids and asking about them, of solving problems at 11 o'clock on a Friday night. That isn't a line on a benchmarking slide. It's a balance sheet that nobody in a Toronto boardroom bothered to read before they put my name on a screen and told 14 people I wasn't worth what they were paying me. The market read it just fine. That quote on my shelf, the one about reputation traveling faster than you do, I used to walk past it every morning without really reading it. After everything that happened with Fletcher Walsh and Cascadia, I can't look at it without thinking about what it actually costs to ignore that truth. What Fletcher got wrong wasn't just the numbers, it was the assumption that value is something you can extract from a spreadsheet. He saw my salary and concluded I was a liability. What he never asked, what he never once considered asking, was how that number came to exist in the first place. 19 years of answer calls, 19 years of knowing which client was dealing with a permitting delay and which one was quietly shopping for a new provider and what the difference was between the two. That knowledge doesn't appear on a benchmarking slide. It lives in the relationship itself, and when the relationship walks out the door, it goes with the person who built it. I've thought a lot about what I could have done differently. Honestly, I'm not sure I'd change much. I didn't walk out of that meeting because I was angry. Though I walked out because staying would have meant accepting the premise that my 19 years were reducible to a market percentile, that the people in that room were entitled to evaluate me without ever having spoken to a single person I served. There's a kind of clarity that comes when someone shows you exactly what they think of you. Fletcher showed me clearly. I just chose to believe him. The thing I'm most glad about is that I made the call to Douglas before I did anything else. Not after. Not in the heat of the moment walking to my car. I went back to my office. I sat down, I thought it through, and then I picked up the phone. That sequence matters. The difference between a decision made from panic and a decision made from clarity is usually about 45 minutes and one phone call to someone you trust. I had Douglas. I had Karen. I had 19 years of people who knew what I actually did. The 30 people who lost their jobs at Cascadia after I left, I think about them. They had nothing to do with what happened in that boardroom. They were just people trying to pay their mortgages, same as me. What happened to them was the downstream consequence of a decision made by someone who had confused efficiency with wisdom. Real intelligence in any business isn't knowing how to cut costs. It's knowing which costs are actually investments and having the honesty to tell the difference even when the number looks uncomfortable on a slide. I don't know what Fletcher Walsh is consulting on now. I genuinely hope he's learned something from it, not because I'm generous, I'm working on that, but because the lesson was expensive for a lot of people who deserved better, and expensive lessons are only worth anything if someone actually takes them. Karen asked me last spring, when the VP title came through, whether I wished I'd gone to Boreal back in July when Douglas first called. I thought about it for a moment. I said no. Because I think I needed to see what I saw in that boardroom. I needed to know that I could sit across from someone who had reduced 19 years to a percentage point, stand up, and walk out with my work still intact. That's not nothing. That's actually everything. The market read the balance sheet just fine. It always does.